our Lucan Bible study where we look at Scripture through the lens of studying the Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, a nice Wesleyan quadrilateral. I promised last week we would be looking at Christmas this week, and so this is from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax lists. This first enrollment occurred when Quirinius governed Syria. Everyone went to their own cities to be enrolled. Since Joseph belonged to David's house and family line, he went up from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to David's city, called Bethlehem in Judea. He went to be enrolled together with Mary, who was promised to him in marriage and who was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for Mary to have her baby. She gave birth to her firstborn child, a son, wrapped him snugly, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the guest room. So what does this little piece of Scripture tell us about Jesus and how he came into the world? So first, we know that Caesar Augustus was the emperor, and Quirinius was the governor of Syria at the time. And that would have been most likely somewhere between the beginning of the ADs and about 14 or so of the ADs. We also know that there was a census ordered, and there was a reason that the census was ordered was because they needed to know how to tax people. It's not that much different than why we do the census today. We need to know about taxes. We need to know about voting, how many representatives we get, that sort of thing. So they were counting the folks so that they would know what to expect as far as how to support the government. We also know that Joseph belonged to David's house and he has to return to his ancestral family home. We know that Joseph and Mary were intended to be married, but were not yet married at this point. And we know that at that time, when their lives are most disrupted, when they have to leave their home and find themselves with ancestral family, that is when Jesus is born. And he is placed in a manger because there's no room in the guest room, and which might not have actually been a bad thing. We tend to think of that as, there was no hospitality for them, but actually, as scholars have looked at that may have been a move of protection to keep Mary, who was in a vulnerable state, isolated from the rest of the family in the main house, and to keep Jesus, who was firstborn, in a safe space as well. So we tend to think of that moment as being one in which they were rejected, but in fact, they may have been protected in that moment. Okay, so that's what Scripture tells us. Now let's look at tradition. So one of the things that we know is that most likely from studying our history, the census was actually probably taking place in the spring. That was typically when censuses were done. We're in one of those again right now as well. So most likely that means that Jesus was born in the spring and not in the winter, like we typically think. So how did it come about that we started celebrating Christmas in the winter? Well, there was no exact date for Jesus's birth. And so as the church was developing and they were looking at what important high holy days they wanted to recognize and celebrate, the birth of Jesus becomes one that they start to consider. But if Jesus was born in the spring, we know also that Jesus' death and resurrection occurred in the spring because it's tied into Passover. So what we were looking at as a church is having two high holy days, probably the holiest of days, birth of Jesus and death and resurrection of Jesus, happening in the same season. Now, pastors, just imagine that nightmare. We could have had a case where Christmas and Easter fell in the exact same week. And I am certain that the church leaders at the time saw the wisdom in not doing that. And so they looked at what are some other possibilities of when we could celebrate Jesus' birthday. Well, there happened to be a Roman holiday at the time called Saturnalia. And it was a debaucherous time. And the Christian church saw that an opportunity to sort of co-opt Saturnalia and redefine it and place it in these terms of celebrating a very meaningful time around our faith. And so the Christian church sort of made a conscious decision to take over Saturnalia and start celebrating it as this time of joy, and a big party, a time of gift exchange, which was happening at Saturnalia anyway, in which they could celebrate the birth of Jesus and the arrival of the wise men when we get around to celebrating Epiphany as well. So that's how we did it. It was really an evangelistic opportunity. It was really taking something that had meaning in the wider secular culture and giving it a Christian understanding so that we had a way of reaching folks with our message of faith in a way that has meaning for them and met them where they were. So, if we reflect on that with our reason, then we realize that the date of Christmas is somewhat arbitrary. We also realize that Christmas, the actual birth of Jesus, actually really occurred in the spring. And that Christmas itself, when it was formalized as a holiday, had an evangelistic purpose and also recognized the need for a time of generosity. So that brings us to experience. And I want to think about the power that the Christmas story has for evangelism. So a few years ago when I was serving in Fort Smith, I had a couple of guys that were doing some odd jobs for me. They were out of work. They were not successfully finding any work. And I didn't want to just give them handouts. And I had some odd jobs I needed done, so I would invite them to come over to the church or come to my house and do odd jobs for me from time to time. And we got to visiting. And one of them said it was close to Christmas, and he mentioned that he had gotten comfortable enough with me to say, I don't actually know the Christmas story. I've heard about Christmas my whole life, but nobody's really sat down and told me about Christmas. And I did. And I shared with him what the meaning of Christmas was and realized the power that story had that we take for granted. People know it and they don't. We've sort of reverted back to the days of Saturnalia when we have an opportunity to share that story of Jesus again. But what we sometimes have to do is make it surprising. Give people a reason to ask about the story or give us a reason to share about the story. I've reflected on the fact that people are putting Christmas lights up right now to bring some joy and to bring some celebration into this moment that we're in. And what a powerful moment that is for us to also put lights on our house and then tell people the Christmas story and tell them what is powerful about following Jesus in a moment like this. It does remind me of a time when we lived in Texas, and there was a woman on our street who was actually dying of cancer. We all knew that she was. We'd been praying for her, but the time was coming when she was really facing the end. And for whatever reason, one night we heard that household shooting off fireworks, and they were trying to run through all the holidays for this woman. So they had gotten to 4th of July. Well, I actually had my Christmas tree still up. It was right around Easter time, and so we all had Easter signs in our front yard, and I turned on my Christmas lights. And there was a person a catty corner across the street from me who still had their Christmas tree up too, and they turned on their Christmas lights. And we spent a week celebrating the things that gave us joy, for that woman. In this moment when we're all seeking joy, when we're all trying to find a way of being community in an interesting space and time and place, let's remember that we can celebrate. We can celebrate Christmas right now. It is actually the Christmas season. We can share joy and use generosity. Taking all the precautionary measures that we need to take. We can give gifts, leave things on people's front porch, and share with them not only from our abundance, but also share with them the love that drives us because we're followers of Jesus Christ. So I invite you all to have Christmas this season. Do something wonderful and generous and share the story so that it brings hope and joy and love and peace into this space and this time. It's been wonderful being with you again this week. Next week, I will share, I think what we're going to look at is when Jesus was a punk teenager, because a lot of us will have had kids at home for homeschool now for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks at that point. So we'll look at how Mary and Joseph managed when Jesus was 13 and had a little bit of an attitude. So we will look at that next week. It's been wonderful seeing you all. I look forward to sitting down with you again next Wednesday night. Thanks.